All right. Good afternoon. My name is David Fields, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Welcome to this event in our Midwestern Professionalization Seminar in East Asian Studies. This seminar is a collaboration between the UW Center for East Asian Studies and the Ohio State University East Asian Studies Center. And I want to thank my colleagues at OSU, including Mitch Lerner, the director there, and Stephanie Metzger for making this series possible. And I should also mention that this series was Mitch Lerner's idea. So all of the credit for what a smashing success it's going to be should go directly to Dr. Lerner. Today's event will help advanced undergraduate students and grad students interested in East Asian studies explore careers in think tanks, and we have an excellent panel today to help us do this. If you are attending this event, it is very likely that you will be interested in the other 3 events in the series. I will be putting links to those events in the chat during this event, and I invite you to check those out, register, and please attend those events as well. For today's event, I will briefly introduce our panelists, and I will keep my introductions very brief since we'll be hearing a great deal about their careers over the next few minutes. Then I will get us started by asking a few questions to the panelists, and then after 30 or 40 minutes, we will take questions from those in attendance. We have an excellent set of panelists today who have all leveraged their expertise in East Asia to pursue careers working in think tanks. They come from a wide variety of backgrounds, work in different kinds of think tanks, and are at different points in their careers. And in our conversation with them today, we hope to give interested members of our audience a sense of what the different paths are to working in a think tank. Our panelists are Katherine Botto, a senior research analyst at the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Katheryn earned her BA at Johns Hopkins University in Sociology, East Asian Studies, and International Studies. Yes, a triple major. And her MA in International Security and Foreign Policy from Yonsei University in Seoul. We also have Kyle Ferrier, a fellow and director of academic affairs at the Korea Economic Institute. Kyle earned his BA at George Mason University and his MSc from the London School of Economics. And finally, we have Dr. Nicholas Lardy, who is the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Dr. Lardy earned his BA at the University of Wisconsin, and we are so delighted to welcome him, at least virtually, back to campus, and he earned his PhD in economics at the University of Michigan. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today and for taking the time to discuss your career paths with us. And I wanted to get us started today with just a very simple question. Why did you become interested in East Asia, and how did you become interested in working at a think tank? So why East Asia, or whatever particular regional focus you have, and why did you choose to use that leverage to use that expertise to work in a think tank? And I think we'll start with Katherine, and then Kyle, and then Dr. Lardy.
Sure. Thank you, David, and nice to see you and to see Kyle and meet Dr. Lardy for the first time. I'm really glad to be here. So I guess I'll preface this by saying I don't think there's, a set path, a way to get into the think tank, working at a think tank. Everyone's career paths are very different, but maybe there's, certain skills that I think cultivating those is very useful and probably kind of uniform across everyone's careers. I got interested in East Asian studies at a very young age. I was very interested in learning foreign languages and started learning Japanese in middle school and really enjoyed it. And then from there, went on to study Chinese for many years and to dabble in Korean. And that, I just from foreign languages ended up, then getting interested in history and culture and politics, which maybe is kind of the reverse for a lot of people. I think a lot of people might first be interested in history or something and then learn the foreign language. But for me, it was definitely the languages were a big draw. So from there, I guess at a young age, I kind of knew I was really interested in the region and wanted to do something related to East Asia in my career. I did not know what those careers are, what would kind of be available, but I knew what I wanted to study. So going into college, like David said, I majored in East Asian Studies and 2 other things because I was ridiculous. I promise you don't need to have 3 majors to have a career in a think tank. Probably don't do that. It was a little bit much. And I went to Johns Hopkins, so I was very lucky to be in close proximity to DC. So in undergrad, I had a lot of internships that allowed me to explore kind of what careers in the area would be like. I interned at Brookings, another think tank. I interned at the US-China Economic Security Commission, a congressional commission. I interned at the International Rescue Committee, so that gave me some more nonprofit experience. I also interned in rural Guizhou at a vocational school there. So I really tried very hard to kind of explore internships through that. And I think I was very, very lucky to be in close proximity to DC. So I had those opportunities because DC is a very expensive place to live. I think it would have been a bit more difficult if I had been, say, in Texas, where I'm from. And then from there, you know, even after doing all those internships, I can't say I knew exactly what a career at the entry level particularly would look like after graduation. I was looking into a lot of different things, but I think the main thing I realized is it's very hard to have a career in policy if you don't have a master's degree. So I was looking for opportunities to do that, and I was very lucky that I ended up getting a Fulbright grant to fund me going to grad school in Korea, which is also how I know David. And I think that's a little known fact that Fulbright, they have research grants and English teaching programs, which I'm sure Kyle will talk about. But there's also some countries in East Asia, including Taiwan, and I think Korea might be the only 2, that you can get your master's funded by Fulbright and go and get a master's degree there. And I think in terms of ending up at a think tank, that was probably the most important thing, was getting really extensive experience in the country you're going to study. So I spent 2 years in Korea, and while I was there, I, you know, continuing on, I guess, the theme from undergrad, really pursued opportunities in the country, work opportunities, and all of that. And I ended up working at USFK for most of my time there, US Forces Korea. So that gave me a very, I think, in-depth perspective of what it's like to be someone actually working on issues in the US-South Korea alliance that I think a lot of people kind of in the policy community don't necessarily get that specific experience of working with USFK. So I think that was a big advantage. And then other than that, I did a lot of research while I was in Korea as well through my MA program. I did a thesis that was a big reason that I was, I guess, noticed by who is now my boss, who wanted to give me an opportunity to work with him as he moved on to Carnegie. So I think those research skills, being able to be a good writer, having extensive experience in the country, having the work experience, even I think when I finished my MA, I was only 3 years out of undergrad, but having all of that experience, I think, was very important to going on to get a career in a think tank. And I can't say I was necessarily looking specifically for a career in a think tank, because the way this field works is sort of, you jump around between institutions, maybe academia, government, back to think tanks, nonprofit, all of that. So it was more about, I knew what issues I was interested in, what area I was interested in, and was open to wherever I could do that. That's basically how I got here.
All right. Thank you, Katie. And thank you for bringing up the Fulbright. And I think probably most of the students attending this will be familiar with the Fulbright program. But if you're not, please, at Wisconsin, you would contact Mark Lillett in the international division. I'm sure at OSU has its own person, but the Fulbright is such a wonderful program for laying a foundation for any career in East Asian studies, whether it's going to be in academia, in think tanks, in business. It's such a wonderful program. All
Can
right.
I add one small thing?
Of course.
That Fulbright obviously is great. But it's very competitive. It's, you know, not everyone maybe that applies will get an opportunity, but if you're interested in grad school abroad, there actually are a lot of different ways that you can get that paid for, probably more easily than you can in the US, through like the Korea government scholarship program, things like that. So if you're looking to get in-country experience, I think that's a really good way that's also more affordable than you might think, even if you don't get a Fulbright.
Wonderful. Thanks, Katie. All right, Kyle, can we hear from you?
Thanks so much, David. Thanks for having me here. Thanks to Dr. Lerner, who's not here, but who came up with this idea. And I'm really glad to be here with Katie and Dr. Lardy. Nice to meet you for the first time. I sort of developed an interest in Korea much later than Katie's interest in languages in Asia came in middle school. I was at George Mason University for my undergrad, and I was just finishing up my junior year, or probably in the middle of my junior year, rather. And I was about to meet all the requirements to graduate, and I only had a degree in international relations, so I had to decide, what did I want to do next? Did I want to graduate early and try and find a job? At that point, I already had internships on the Hill with U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer. It was at the height of the global financial crisis at the time, and had a internship at the Department of Commerce under my belt, working on international trade issues. And I decided, since I had this interest in economics as well, that I would take on an additional major. I had taken some classes. I thought I maybe could minor in economics, but I really turned that economics interest into a second major. And then I was thinking, well, economics, international relations are both really broad. I should probably think about an area of interest that I would be able to pursue. And it was in the spring semester, my junior year, where I realized both my interest in international political economy and Asia. It was during a course that I took at George Mason on the political economy of East Asia. And I was also doing an internship at the State Department on focusing on international U.S. business market access in East Asia, working on issues such as Samsung and Apple intellectual property rights, as well as I was part of the team that helped draft the initial talking points for the State Department on Google leaving China, which was a really cool experience as an intern. And through that academic and sort of hands-on experience at the State Department, I realized I should probably get over to Asia if I want to work in Asia, and was fortunate that summer between my junior and senior year that I was accepted for a student position to more or less be the program assistant in the Population of Bureau of Refugees and Migration office within the State Department, working on Asian refugees Asian migration issues. And through that, I got really interested in the North Korea situation and whether or not they were called North Korean refugees, North Korean economic migrants, et cetera. And so I kind of realized the confluence of all my interests were Korea. And I had applied, and it was sort of late in my career at that point, academic career in undergrad, to have applied for a Fulbright grant, nor did I really know what I wanted to study specifically. I have a lot of broad interests. And so I applied for a Fulbright English teaching assistantship, which was the teaching part of the Fulbright grant that you could pursue. And I lived in Korea from 2011 to 2012, where I taught English at an all-boys middle school. Teaching wasn't necessarily my calling, but it was an absolutely fantastic way to get to know the language, the people, the culture, as well as take some time to learn more about some of the issues that I was interested in while I was there. And after coming back from Korea in 2012, I tried to get a job in DC, and it was really difficult for me. I had all these internships. I didn't want to do a paid internship. Sorry, I didn't want to do a unpaid internship again after doing all those unpaid jobs. And so I couldn't find anything, moved back to New York, where I'm from, to try and take try my hand at banking. Realized within the first 2 weeks that I really didn't like the job. So I planned my exit pretty quickly, and I landed on doing a master's degree in international political economy in the London School of Economics, where I wrote my master's dissertation on regional financial cooperation in Asia. So it's all these things that I was very much interested in, and sort of how I came to wind up at KEI was that my set of skills were a bit different from others who are working on Korea. I think there's a lot of people in the field who work on the North Korea nuclear issue, and at the time, KEI was looking to move in a direction that would have someone that would focus a little bit more on Korea domestic, international economic issues, and mostly from the perspective of the South. So that really helped me get a leg up there. But much like Katie, I was just interested in working on Korea economic issues. And so that's why I was wound up at KEI. I think it was a great fit for all parties. And so happy to talk a little bit more about my role at KEI and my zigzaggy career later on. But thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Kyle. And now we have two Fulbright alumni on this call. And I don't know, perhaps Dr. Lardy has also done a Fulbright at some point in the future or at some point in the past. But yeah, I also was a beneficiary of a Fulbright research grant. So I guess if you're taking notes, maybe step one is make sure you get a Fulbright scholarship. And that's always a path to somewhere. Thank you, Dr. Lardy. Can we hear about your career path into Peterson?
Yes, I'll be brief. I was first interested in Asia in part. My father was a professor of biochemistry at the University of Wisconsin, and he had some postdocs and occasionally a graduate student from Korea, Japan, or Taiwan. So at a pretty young age, they'd come to the house for events of one sort or another. And so I was interacting, even when I was in grade school, I was, more aware of, began to be aware of Asia. But a real turning point for me was the 1960 Democratic primary in Wisconsin, which of course was Kennedy versus Humphrey. And I was very interested in politics. And after the presidential campaign, there was a book by Theodore H. White. And he actually wrote two books, one after the 60 election and one after the 64 election. Was called The Making of the President. It was kind of an inside story about how the campaigns ran. Well, when I read this first volume, I noticed on the inside that he had written 10, 15 years earlier, a book about China. And so I got that book. It was called Thunder Out of China. And it was about the rise of the Communist Party and the conflict between the Kuomintang and the CCP. And so that kind of cemented my interest in China. So as an undergraduate, I started studying Chinese in the mid-60s. I also liked economics. I liked the classes in economics. So I really decided at that point I was going to combine these two interests. And I did that, as David said, getting a PhD at the University of Michigan. Then I went off to teach at Yale for 8 years, and then at the University of Washington for 12 years. But around 1994 or 95, I can't remember, I was approached by the Brookings Institution to come to Washington. They were looking for somebody that did stuff on China, and they hadn't had an economist. So I had a leave of absence, and I came to Washington with my family. I didn't know whether I'd like a think tank environment or not. It turned out I liked it quite a bit. And so I think I spent 8 years at Brookings, and then I moved literally across the street to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, where I've been since roughly 2003. So I've been focused on the Chinese economy for quite a few decades, first as a graduate student and later as an academic, and now a researcher in a think tank.
All right, thank you so much for that. And so you don't all have the Fulbright in common, but one thing you do all have in common is languages. And I think it almost goes without saying, but to work in East Asia, the languages are really, really key. And probably most of our attendees today have already started down that path. But if you're interested and have not, it's never too late. I didn't start studying Korean until I was 23. So there's plenty of time still. Well, thank you for telling us a little bit about what your career paths are. For the second question, I wonder if each of you work at a think tank, but the think tanks that you work for are all quite different in terms of their size, in terms of their goals, in terms of where they focus and what kind of issues they focus on. I wonder if each of you can just describe the organization you work for and what your particular role in that organization is. What is a normal working day like for you, if there is such a thing as a normal working day in the job you do? We're trying to give people interested in think tanks a sense of diversity that exists in these institutions. So if we could hear from maybe Kyle and then Dr. Lardy and then Katherine on this.
Sure. So my organization is the Korea Economic Institute of America, KEI for short. We often sort of joke that we're not so much, the E in our middle name isn't so much economics as it is everything. And we pretty much cover everything and anything related to the Korean Peninsula, politics, security, economics, or otherwise, from a US-Korea bilateral perspective, or Korea in the region or Korea in the world. And we're a little bit different in that we're a think tank, and we also do a lot of public affairs, public outreach. So my job is sort of falls within both of those areas, public outreach as well as what you would more traditionally consider as part of a think tank. And that's really where my Director of Academic Affairs title rolls in. I am in charge of overseeing KEI's university programs. So we do simulations, run panels, and do talks like these at universities around the country to try and keep people engaged, students engaged on issues related to the US-Korea alliance. And obviously there's been a huge increase in attention given to Korea, both because of headlines and the growing importance or growing popularity of K-pop and Hallyu, the Korea cultural wave. So a lot of different reasons why people are attracted to Korea, and we're trying to sort of engage with them as much as we can. And there are people on staff who deal with other groups, deal with other organizations outside of the Beltway, but it's my role to sort of help coordinate on the university outreach side. Other than that, though, in terms of more traditional think tank work, I do a lot of, at least I oversee 2 of our academic publications, one of which Katie actually wrote a paper for recently. And I also do a lot of writing, both for KEI on our blog and some reports, but outside writing for other journals. And I'm a regular contributor to the Asia-focused online magazine, The Diplomat. So just really focusing on a whole litany of issues and sort of being a jack of all trades, but sort of having that home base of focusing on economics and the political economy of all these different issues.
Thank you. E is for everything. That's helpful, because as I was looking through your website, I was noticing that KEI does do a bit of everything, and the focus is not just economics. Dr. Lardy, can you talk to us a little bit about Peterson and the type of work that it does?
Well, in a way, Peterson is similar to KEI. KEI has a very tight geographic focus. They're not writing papers about France or South Africa. Peterson has a very tight focus on a functional area, which is basically international trade and international economics. And so we have a lot of research that looks at everything related to trade and finance. Of course, that takes you into a lot of domestic issues like monetary policy for promoting economic expansion. We also look at a lot of issues like inequality, for example, is it exacerbated by more trade or less trade? So the linkages between trade and finance, and a lot of other issues like economic growth, inequality, climate change, and so forth. So we're relatively focused. Unlike a Brookings or a CSIS, we don't have a lot of internal programs. Everybody is working on their own research agenda. We don't have a China program and a trade program. And it's small enough that most people know what most other people are doing. It's very collaborative and interactive. And I think it's, at least for me, it's been a very good environment. In terms of how you allocate your time, I'm more of a book person. I've written a number of books over the years about the Chinese economy, several for Cambridge University Press, then a couple at Brookings. And I think 3 or 4 since I got to Peterson. But a lot of my colleagues do more blogging and tweeting and short-term stuff, and they don't want to dig down. They're focusing on issues that are, shall we say, more fleeting and not, never going to be the subject of a lengthy treatment. So I do that, and then of course you leverage that into, becoming an authority on a range of issues that are related to your research. I spend a lot of time talking to people in the media. I was on Bloomberg earlier this afternoon. I talk a lot to people in the press and some in policy, although in the Trump administration, they had a number of people that thought they knew everything about China, and they weren't exactly reaching out. So in previous administrations, I'd be going to see the Treasury Secretary fairly regularly, and I had a chance to brief both President Clinton and President Obama before their trips to China. So it's pretty diverse. And people sometimes ask me, well, do you prefer the academic world or the think tank world? And I like both. I think I had 20 years as a full-time academic, and I thought I'd try switching to a think tank, and it agreed with me. So now I've been doing that for about 20 years. So it's not a question of either or. I would just say one thing, and that is a think tank like Peterson tends to hire people that have pretty established reputations. So they tend to hire people, that are in their 40s or 50s. We're not hiring, well, we have a few junior people, but the model, at least as I observe it, is people get hired when there's a sense that, okay, we really need a well-known person to deal with, international trade. And the last person we hired had been a professor at Brandeis, then he worked for the Council of Economic Advisors. So I don't know how old he is, but he's probably in his mid-40s. So at least at Peterson, very few people start their careers there. A lot of people end their careers there.
All right, thank you. And please tell us, Dr. Lardy, that people are consulting you right now in the Biden administration. Or maybe you can't, but please just give us a nod or something that we've turned a corner on this issue.
Well, I've chatted with a couple, but I think they're digging on China. They're digging down. I think this announcement today that Blinken will meet Young Jie in Alaska next week is quite interesting.
All right, thank you for that. Katie, can you talk to us a little bit about Carnegie?
Sure, I'll try to be briefer than I was earlier. Carnegie is definitely, out of the 3 think tanks represented here, the largest and probably one of the largest in DC. So we have kind of some, I guess the way we're organized and some of our resources are kind of different from other think tanks. We, by virtue of our size, have access to things like we actually have a library in our think tank and a librarian who can get us subscriptions to various publications, facilitate interlibrary loan, et cetera, getting me David's book through ILL, things like that. So, and we also have global centers. We're a very global think tank. So we actually have 5 other centers abroad, including one in China, which is definitely an advantage, having a lot of people on the ground in East Asia, in addition to our really broad network of non-resident fellows who also are scattered across the world. So my job, I think something that Dr. Lardy said is really important. Think tanks are, I think most think tanks are very top heavy. It is kind of a place for experts in their field to land and, advise everyone with their vast amount of knowledge. So I have been very lucky that despite being not that far into my career, I've landed in a position where I am able to do a lot of my own research and writing, and also collaborative research and writing, and put out my own independent work and research. So a lot of my day-to-day probably actually looks a lot like some of your students. It's just a lot of research and writing. And that is, I do a lot of work on longer reports. So maybe like a 30,000 word report a couple of times a year. I also do more short form stuff, commentaries, talking to the media, things that everyone else has said. So I think it's really important in my position to be able to both very quickly respond to current events that are going on and be able to based on the deeper knowledge I have on the issue, give a very quick perspective, either in writing, like a 900-word commentary for like the Nikkei Asian Review or various other outlets, or through talking to the media. So that's very important. And in addition to that, I also manage a lot of grants. I think that's something people kind of overlook in the think tank community. Most think tanks are nonprofit. I don't know if Peterson is or not, or the structure of some other think tanks, but we're technically nonprofit, which means we have to fundraise a lot of the funding for our research. So for me, that's some fundraising for my own research, but a lot of managing grants for the Korea program in general, making sure that we're meeting targets, managing budgets, et cetera, which was something I had zero experience with before I started. So that has been a learning experience, but a really good skill to have. And I think actually a lot of positions that are going to be more entry level in think tanks might be in that development area with fundraising or in communications. A lot of stuff like at Carnegie on the programmatic side, like if you want to be in the Asia program or something, can be entry level positions. If you don't have a master's, will probably be more admin related program coordinator positions. It's still really good experience, but there is kind of a need to transition. If you want to transition into more substantive like research positions, you kind of need a master's or some other extensive experience to get there. But yeah, that's basically what I do.
All right. Thank you for that, Katie. And I encourage members of our audience, I'm going to ask one more question, but I encourage you to be getting your questions ready, and please ask them through the Q&A function in Zoom or in the chat. And I'm sure our panelists would be happy to answer any questions that you have. For the final question that I think I am going to ask, and I feel like all of you have touched on this a little bit already, so maybe you wouldn't have too much more to add, but you've all had interesting careers. You've all had interesting opportunities. Kyle, you worked at in banking. You said you didn't like it. Dr. Lardy, you worked in the academy for many years, and yet you're at think tanks and you've stayed there for your career so far. And I just wonder if you can tell us what is compelling about working at a think tank. What is and I'm sure, like any job, there's the good points and there's the bad points. I'm kind of curious as to what are the really good points. What is the best part of your job that you get excited about when you get out of bed every morning? And maybe we could hear from Dr. Lardy, and then Kyle, and then Kathryn.
Well, at Peterson, I think there are lots of very strong points. We have been able to attract some. We don't have a lot of outside speakers, but we will get the chairman of the Federal Reserve or the Treasury Secretary or the head of the IMF. Those are the kinds of people we can bring in for talks and public events and some private discussions as well. And many of us, as I mentioned earlier, also have reasonably good access over time to officials in the administration. That's something that you're not going to be able to do in a university setting. Maybe you could if you were at George Washington or Georgetown, but I think it's pretty tough to do. The other great advantage, particularly for somebody interested in Asia, at most think tanks, people can travel just about as much as they want. Usually the money is coming from some other source. If somebody wants me to come and give a talk or go to China, which I've done many times, I don't have to go to somebody and beg for an airfare. And if you don't have to be in class 2 or 3 days a week, you can take advantage of a lot of opportunities to go to conferences and meetings and things that you simply can't do in an academic environment where you have to be in the classroom, at least in places I've been, 2 or 3 times a week. Although I know there are people that arrange their schedules so they can spend 5 days in Asia and come back and teach their class, but that's pretty tough. So that's another advantage. And the great advantage of Peterson, and I think we are a little bit different than most, is that most scholars don't spend any time directly on fundraising. The fundraising is done by the president and a very small staff. I've never had to write a proposal that went to a foundation that then they wanted you to revise, and then they were looking over your shoulder about, how quickly you were getting the product out. So at least at Peterson, that I think that's a very substantial advantage for somebody who wants to and be engaged in writing and research, and not have to worry about raising the money.
Wow. I think I want to work at Peterson. Sounds like a great opportunity. But I would miss all the students. All of my students are in this call. I would miss you, and that's why I will stay at the University of Wisconsin. Kyle, can we hear a little bit about KEI, about the most compelling part of what you do there?
Yeah, I'll just say I had all this internship background in government, and I mentioned the last position I had in the State Department. If I had wanted to, there was probably a pretty decent chance that I could have been converted to a full-time position if I had stayed. It was like a student temporary employment position with a possible track to being transitioning to becoming permanent. But I had realized that a lot of people of the people who I most looked up to working in government, a lot of them had spent time outside of government before going directly to work there. And so I said, I'll leave, I'll go to Korea, I'll pursue all these other things, and maybe I'll come back. But the more and more I think about it, one of the best things about the think tank world versus the government world is that you have the freedom to speak your mind pretty much. And so you're working on all these issues that you would the people in the government are working on, but you get to comment on them openly, which is great. And I think especially in the past 4 years, there was certainly a lot for people in the think tank community to comment on and be sort of trying to drive that public, trying to drive that public discourse. So that was really fantastic, and having the opportunity, the administration does X, and then I can respond by saying, this is wrong for Y and Z reasons, and we need to do A, B, and C, something along those lines. I think that was a really, I think being able to have that mouthpiece is a really great part of working at a think tank. You have that freedom, and at KEI specifically, you get to focus on anything and everything related to Korea. And so I think it's a little bit different from other think tanks in town who tend to be a bit more security focused on the Korean Peninsula, or either on the economic, if someone who works on Korea at Peterson may be more focused on the economic side of things, but we focus on pretty much all the different aspects of it. So if you're interested in Korea, it gives you a good platform to comment and be involved in the discourse on everything and anything related to Korea in Washington.
Thank you for that, Kyle. How about you, Kathryn? What is the most compelling thing you do at Carnegie?
Sure. I mean, I think similar to what everyone else has said, I think the advantage of working in a think tank is the freedom that you get, like the freedom that I can, if I see an issue that is important and I think there's something that needs to be said about it, I can write about it. I have a platform to do that. I have people for some reason that are interested in hearing what I have to say about it, which is something that actually was kind of uncomfortable for me at first. Someone like having kind of a public, so much out there and your ideas out there, but it really is such a privilege to have that platform. And also I would say the community, like the Korea policy community is actually quite small, much smaller than you might think it is in DC, the DC based community. So everybody kind of knows each other, and there are people working on everything. And if you need input on something, there's somebody who's an expert about it and is excited to talk to you about it. So I think that is really great. And in addition to the access to, it still blows my mind sometimes that I will brief people in the government who might consider the ideas that I have. But I try very hard to, think deeply about those things and recommend something good. And we do have the freedom to spend a lot of time on a single issue that maybe people in government don't have, and to come up with creative solutions, think outside the box a little bit. So I think, yeah, I really enjoy it for all of those reasons.
All right. Thank you Thank you, Katherine. We have questions coming in from the audience now, and one is I feel like what's probably on everyone's mind, and it comes from our co-organizer, Mitch Lerner, so I absolutely have to ask it, and that is, what would you, as panelists, suggest current students do right now to enhance their own possibilities for employment upon graduation? What really matters most for them to get their first position in a think tank, the kind that you work for? And maybe this is more a question for Kyle and Katherine than Nick, as you've kind of described the way Peterson works. And he says, is it language skills? Is it travel? Is it studying the region of expertise, an active record of publication, media experiences, strong grades, good letters of recommendations from faculty? What is it? I mean, I'm sure all of those would be helpful, but what do you see? And maybe just think back to your own experiences, when you were on the outside looking in, and maybe now that you're on the inside looking out and you're seeing other people trying to get in. What can our students do right now?
I think three things: writing experience, experience abroad, and connections are extremely important. And with the writing experience, as a student, you have many opportunities to get that experience. You should be taking writing intensive courses. If you have the option to do a senior thesis or something, I don't know what your programs are like, you should absolutely do that. It's a way to show that you are capable of doing in-depth research. Also, another thing I did in undergrad was I very actively sought out opportunities to be a research assistant on some of my professors' research. I'm sure lots of professors could use the help and might be willing to, I don't know. I don't want to speak for you guys, David, but I'm sure there might be some opportunities like that. So anything you can do to get that experience and then to represent it on your resume very clearly. I think some people think, the skills you might be getting in like an East Asian Studies program, other than language, are kind of soft skills. But if you can, there are ways you can represent that on your resume as something really tangible. Like, I wrote something this long and used this research methodology and worked with this professor on it or something, and it is really, really important. Going abroad, also very important. I think it's hard to have credibility on these issues if you haven't lived abroad. There are a lot of opportunities to do that, like with funding, because I know it can be really expensive. I wouldn't have had those opportunities if I didn't find funding for it. Could do a whole panel on that, and then connections. I know it sucks to kind of to have to think about that. And it was something that was very, very intimidating to me in undergrad, but I realized very quickly, like, a lot of the ways that you would get, and even internships, is by finding someone that's willing to give you an opportunity, because these positions do get so many applications. You have to stand out, and I think you'll find a lot of people are willing to talk to you. I'm always, if anybody wants to reach out, I'm always willing to talk to students. The one thing I would say is, if you're going into an informational interview, come prepared with questions. Like, don't come into that interview. It's a big pet peeve of mine when I talk to students and they come into the interview just kind of expecting me to talk about my career and how I got there. Like, you really should come prepared and come prepared to show why you're interested in the field. So those three things, I think: experience abroad, making some connections, which you can do even though you're not in DC, and getting really good writing and research experience are the most important.
Thank you for that, Katherine. I love the enumeration. Whenever, as my students will tell you, whenever I lecture, I never have more than 3 points and I never have less than 3 points. So you've given us a wonderful 3 points that will hopefully stick in their brains. How about you, Kyle? What would you have to add?
That was such a comprehensive answer. The only thing I'll add to it is on connections. I think that is really super important too. Everything else that Katie mentioned is really important. But I think a good way to make connections that I used was LinkedIn. And it was a really, I think it's sort of underappreciated tool now. But what I would encourage students to do, if you're interested in a specific thing, so now we're talking about all our own specific interests, but if our interests don't match up with yours, it's okay. Go online, go to LinkedIn, sort of search what sort of organizations and people work on the things that you're interested in, and follow them, see what organizations they work for, and then you can learn about those organizations, and then follow up on their work. And I know a lot of people in DC when we put stuff out there, just like everyone else, we like feedback, and we like good feedback. So if you read something that you read from someone that you think is really good, feel free to send them a note or try to connect with them on LinkedIn and use that to try and set up an informational interview. That'll be really helpful, because you never know where the next job opportunities are going to open up. So it's really good to sort of cast as broad of a net as possible, especially if you're trying to go in a relatively narrow direction. It's probably best that you're covering all respective bases in that field. And like Katie mentioned, the career policy field is pretty small, and you might think DC is a big place, but the policy fields aren't necessarily very broad and expansive, especially when it comes to the think tank community. So I would just encourage students to use LinkedIn and maybe other social media tools to sort of help build their networks and make those connections.
Twitter is huge for the policy community. And I mean, there's a lot of pressure to be tweeting your hot takes on everything all the time. But I mean, I'm constantly on Twitter consuming, that's how I find out a lot about what other people are researching and stuff like that. And have definitely had students reach out on that platform and engage there. And I think that's good too. And if you're Gen Z, you probably know how to do that already. So.
Let me just say something. I agree connections are very important, but I think particularly for an audience in Ohio or Wisconsin, I think historically students at the DC-based schools had a tremendous edge on getting internships, because a lot of the classes are taught by people who work full-time in the government or for think tanks, and you get the connection, you get an internship, and you can parlay that into something. But in the last decade or maybe even longer, now all the internships that I'm aware of get posted on websites. I just saw 3 new internship positions opening up at the US-China Business Council last week. And so the advantage of being on the ground in DC is still there, but I don't think it's quite as powerful as it was a long time ago. So I don't think people sitting in the Midwest somewhere should feel that they don't have a shot at some of these positions.
And thank you for that, Dr. Lardy. And I know that's one of the ideas that Mitch and I had for why we wanted to do this is, I think for some of our students, it's a long way from Madison to DC, or it's lesser from Columbus to DC, but still a long ways away. And looking through your bios, I did see that both Kyle and Kathryn did go to DC schools for their undergraduate, and so had that experience. But then it's interesting that also that actually then you left DC and ended up coming back. So yeah, I think it's important to recognize that just because you didn't go to a DC school or because you're at Wisconsin or Ohio State, that you can still do this, that this is still a possibility for you. All right. Oh.
So Twitter, LinkedIn are good, but troll the websites, because all these organizations, I mean, I think it's a legal requirement now almost that you have to publicly announce positions. It doesn't mean there might be some inside candidates who are going to get hired, but I think it's more open than it was historically.
Thank you. We have another question here. And actually, it's been partially answered, but I'm curious about how essential an MA is to getting an entry-level job at a think tank. Is it kind of a requirement, or is it possible to get hired straight out of undergrad? All of you have graduate degrees, but I wonder what you see from the inside.
Well, I can say pretty categorically, almost nobody is hired that doesn't have a PhD in economics.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's a very precise threshold that may not be relevant for the people on the call today.
I think it's definitely relevant at you're going to have to get a master's at some point, pretty much. Not everybody, some people are able to, make their way up without, but I think you just would be competing with people that have master's degrees for so many of these jobs, whether it's required or not, that it can kind of put you at a disadvantage. But that doesn't mean there aren't positions that you can do with just an undergraduate degree. Like at Carnegie, it's just, and maybe I think some of the other larger think tanks, most of those positions a lot of them are going to be like have more admin aspects, which is not a bad thing. Like being able to show that you're like, don't look down on that stuff. Being able to show that you're like ready to do that and, you know, efficient with admin tasks is also very important to being, you know, just considered someone that is a reliable employee at your institution. So, and you would, by working there in a position like that, get a lot more connections that could help you, you know, find your next job. So, but I think if you want to be doing more substantive research, even at mid-level and even entry level, an MA is probably required. And then, like Dr. Lardy said, at some point, most people, maybe not most, but a lot of people get PhDs. And if they don't have a PhD, they probably have very extensive experience in government, if not both. I would say probably a lot of people have both. So you do need to get more education probably.
Yeah, and I think even for the jobs in administration, communications that necessarily wouldn't be focusing on substantive research, because the field is so competitive at the moment. I think that a lot of those jobs do also require a lot of master's degrees, or people who hold those positions have master's degrees. I was just thinking there's only a handful of people I can think of that have been hired recently that only have a bachelor's degree and not some sort of master's degree at some of the think tanks that I know of across town. So just something else to consider too for those positions.
We have a couple of questions from students right now who are PhD candidates in history, which is a position that's very near and dear to my heart, since it's not long ago that I was one of those. And I think they're wondering, how can you position yourself, or what, if you have a PhD in history, what are some things and experiences you can do to maybe prepare yourself for a career in a think tank, or to make you appealing for a think tank position? Because as often happens with a PhD in history, you're overqualified for a lot of entry level positions, but you might be underqualified for senior level positions. So do your think tanks hire people with PhDs? I know Nick Peterson does, but only in economics. So I wonder, Kathryn and Kyle, do your institutions hire people with PhDs, but maybe people who are just coming out of graduate school, or is that a more difficult path?
We don't have, we've hired PhDs in the past, but those were for more people in more senior leadership roles. But I think other institutions in town, I do know of several like research fellows who have PhDs in history. They just work on modern history, and so they're able to sort of relate their own expertise to what's going on at the moment. Because a lot of times there is a greater focus on contemporary issues within think tanks, but then there are also think tanks that do focus on historical issues in the East Asia field. One that clearly stands out is the Wilson Center, and their Cold War History Project is probably the best place in town to work on Korea history issues, and probably the same for East Asia history.
I think we have lost Kyle for just a moment. Katie, would you have anything to add to someone who is a PhD candidate in history who's maybe looking to get into this field?
Sure. I mean, I think, is Kyle coming back? Maybe, I don't know. I'm hearing Kyle in the background.
Places in town.
I don't know what's going on. Can you hear me, David?
Yes. Okay.
I would say that I don't think that there's a lot of hiring for people just out of a PhD program. But I mean, having a PhD in history is amazing. Like you really need the historical context to analyze any of these issues. So it's certainly an asset. I think the positions in think tanks probably that someone just coming out of their PhD would look at are kind of shorter term, like at least for Korea, I think the like Korea Foundation Next Gen Scholars program, I think is what it's called, is a lot of people who are very recently out of their PhD might get that. and then end up affiliated with think tanks or other sort of visiting scholar sort of positions that are funded through various foundations and programs kind of outside the think tank. I hope that makes sense. That kind of might be a weird answer if you don't know exactly how think tanks work, but there are positions, but I mean, you might consider going into government if you're really interested in working at a think tank and you're just out of your PhD program. That might not be kind of, you're not going to be doing the same research kind of oriented position that you might want. But I think that like having a PhD and having experience in government is like the background for think tanks if you want to be really successful in this industry. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Katherine. And I think we have Kyle back now. Sorry, Kyle, we lost you for a minute and we moved on. Well, another question that I think would be helpful to address is, so you really know, imagine that you're a student in East Asian studies, you really know that you want to work in policy, but you're kind of open-minded about what you could or what you should do. And so you've all made it quite clear that, a master's degree is pretty important to get in there. What do you think the growth areas are going to be for jobs in think tanks in the future? You can get a master's degree in policy. You could go on, you could get one in economics, you could get one in area studies. Where are the growth areas? Is it going to be big tech? Is it going to be data? What would you advise a student who's just on that cusp of finishing their undergrad and maybe entering graduate school, and they're just looking for a focus that will be something that's hopefully in demand?
Well, I know a few people that have done reasonably well with, getting a public policy type degree at, a place like Harvard or Princeton, the Wilson School, where you learn a lot of skills, but you're not focused on just Korea or just China or something like that. So if you had even if you had an interest in a particular geography, you could get a degree that provides you with a range of skills that would have broad application over time. Quantitative skills, writing skills, and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, like focusing on the skills that are going to get you where you need to go. I mean, subject matter is important. And if you're thinking about like what subject areas are growing, I think probably, yeah, tech is really big. Non-traditional security issues like climate and environmental issues, I would say are growing. The traditional security field in DC and those positions in think tanks is pretty saturated. So if you have some non-traditional security issue you're interested in, I think that's really useful. Another one might be space. We actually just launched a space program at Carnegie that I think is very promising. And I don't know how many other think tanks are doing that, but I think maybe in the next 10 years, that'll be something to look at.
Yeah, I just want to echo what everyone else has said so far, but definitely tech. I'm doing a lot of research myself on 5G, AI, robotics. They're working on Korea. Korea is very involved in all of that, and then China and other major advanced economies in Asia are as well. And that'll be super important, especially as we try to think about the intersection of economics and security moving forward. There's that. Global public health, obviously because of the pandemic, and climate, I think are all key areas that are probably going to be receive a lot more attention than they have in the recent past. And there's going to be a lot to learn as a lot more develops. But I would also like to agree with Dr. Lardy and Katie with focusing on skills and sort of using that as a platform to learn about new areas, and you be a bit more flexible that way.
All right. We have a question that's kind of directed towards Katherine and Kyle, and it notes that you both have your MAs from international institutions, as opposed to doing an MA, somewhere in DC. Do you think that was an advantage for you? Would you recommend that other students pursue that, or if they're looking at different schools to do their MAs, how would you advise them?
I don't know if Kyle, if you want to go first, I feel like I'm talking a lot, but okay. I think yes. Abroad is a great, I get this question a lot because I think some people are interested in going abroad for their master's, but they're worried that they'll miss out on like the DC connections and the internships here. And that's valid. But the other thing to consider is, I mean, you're getting long-term, like at least a year, if not 2 years experience in the country. You're probably going to be getting a lot more language experience. And in terms of connections, I think actually it was way better for me to be in Korea than DC. I mean, I met all the people that were doing Fulbright. But in general, like the community of expats is so much smaller that like if you are associating with other Americans, they might be people that are in much higher positions than you are that might not, you might not be interacting with in the same circles in DC. So I had a lot of friends at the embassy, a lot of people at USFK, journalists, who I used to like read their stuff before I moved to Korea. And then you end up, hanging out with them and they're part of your social circle. So, I mean, I feel like I had a really strong network when I came back to DC, and that was, I don't think I would have that network if I hadn't gone to Korea. That said, one disadvantage is it is a little bit, you definitely have to do a lot of legwork to prepare for transitioning back to a job in the US because you're not here. Like you're gonna have to look pretty hard for those opportunities. You're gonna have to look hard for opportunities regardless. This field is competitive. There aren't necessarily that many entry-level opportunities, but it's something I think if you're preparing for it, if you're really thinking about it like a year in advance, it's not a big challenge. So yeah, I think totally go abroad. There's a lot of funding for it. Even if there's not funding, it's way cheaper. I think Yonsei, where I went, is the most expensive maybe school in Korea because it's private, and it was like $7,000 a year or something. Don't quote me on that price exactly, but compared to a school in the US, it's a lot cheaper.
Cheaper than Georgetown.
Much cheaper than Georgetown.
Yeah, picking up on that thread, I had a very different international education experience. I went to grad school in London. It's very different from an American going to grad school in Seoul. And Katie mentioned the importance of her network that she got from doing her master's in Korea. My core network in DC is from doing Fulbright in Korea, and so my that was sort of where I landed off of that. But at LSE, to be honest, the key drawing point there was price point, without necessarily trading off name recognition, without having to do all the additional legwork to explain to people what the university is. I know in Korea policy communities, Yonsei University is very prestigious, very well known. But if you're trying to go into something outside of Korea, you might have to take another step or two to explain it. But Katie's resume certainly, I'm sure, explains itself. But it's just there are certain advantages and disadvantages with going to school overseas. And LSE still had name recognition in the US, but you didn't necessarily have to pay US tuition costs, which is also sort of important because to be honest, the DC think tank world, the salaries are also kind of striated. So when you're trying to get a job in the think tank world, if you have $200,000 in debt from a major policy school in the US, and you're taking on an entry-level job at a think tank, you're probably only going to make, like, if you're lucky, $50,000 to $60,000 a year. And so the debt to income level is definitely a bit skewed towards the debt level. And so for me, in order to have that flexibility is part of the reason why I went to school overseas. And like Katie mentioned, you do sort of trade off some things by not studying in the US. But for me, that price point issue, I know it's something that everyone has to think about, was sort of the key, one of the key reasons which drove me to LSE. And LSE is also the most expensive school in probably all of Europe.
All right. We have another question here that's very targeted at our specific moment that we're living in, and that is asking if these internship opportunities have moved online. So is there opportunities for someone from Wisconsin to get involved in think tank work during this pandemic? Are you seeing that happen from where you sit in DC? Maybe let's go right to you, Kyle, since you're shaking your head.
Well, I was just going to say, we have 2 interns now, one of which is in California, over the or in the previous intern class. One was in DC, one was in New York, and over the course of the pandemic, we've had interns overseas, we've had interns in DC. So now is the time. The pandemic is really the great equalizer in that sense, because we're all working from home. You have the opportunity to work from DC. And I know a lot of DC semester programs are sort of feeling the pain because no one's coming to DC to work in DC anymore. But I think their loss is your advantage, and I would highly encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity to work virtually. And I think even moving forward, previously before the pandemic, there was this mentality of, well, you have to be here to do the work, and we had that mentality until we realized, well, we have to do the work, well, not without being in the office. And we've adjusted, and we're probably going to have some lasting impacts from those adjustments. And so I would imagine people like organizations like KEI and other think tanks around town will be more open to having at least one virtual intern moving forward.
Carnegie doesn't have interns, so I can't really comment on that, but I would just, I do want to plug our junior fellows program, which is kind of the most like entry-level program we have, but you would apply at the beginning of your senior year in undergrad and then be able to come to Carnegie in a research position for a year through this junior fellows program. I can send David more info about that to pass on to your students if you like.
Of course.
But I would say, geography, I think what Kyle's saying is definitely true, but if things do go back to in-person, and geography is more of a barrier, look at universities in your area, and if they have opportunities for you to help with research. I think that's a really good first position. Actually, my first position out of college, I didn't go straight to Korea. I actually was a policy research fellow at the School of International Studies in DC, and that was very much like assisting a professor with his research. So I think that, there are universities everywhere. You go to a university, there's research going on, you can do some writing. You could probably find more think tanky kind of opportunities there.
All right. One very last targeted question, then I'll ask for some final thoughts. And that is a question we get from a student who's in a JD program and wondering, are there opportunities for that particular degree or in think tanks? And Nick, you can feel free to reflect on your time at Brookings too. So maybe perhaps not at Peterson.
Because the only person that we've had at Peterson with a JD degree also has a PhD in economics. So
okay.
Double threat. And he's done a lot of very interesting work on antitrust and, kind of the intersection of trade sanctions and other international economic issues that have a very strong legal dimension. Anyway, that's the only person with a legal background, with a legal degree that is at Peterson.
Yeah, I don't know specifically, but I would just echo that saying, like, you need to leverage whatever experience you have. And if you can tailor it to, highlight those transferable skills from your JD program to whatever position you're looking at, just like you would do in any job. I think that having a JD could be a very good experience. So I can't say it's common that's, the most common degree to have, but.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. I want to just ask one last question. We've had a lot of things put on the table. Obviously, language is important. Going abroad is important. Getting research skills is important. I wonder though if you can just close us with some parting advice, some words of wisdom to anyone who's thinking about their future and who is thinking about a job in a think tank. What is the most important thing? What is the most important thing that you feel like they can do now? Reiterate some of the things that you've said earlier, and end on a bang here today. Maybe I can ask Katie to go first.
Sure. I mean, I think I've said a lot of kind of things that can go on your resume, but also just your attitude is really important. at the end of the day, people want to work with people that they like and that they get along with. And this community is small. At least I'm speaking about Korea, but you know, a lot of these issue area circles can be pretty small. And just coming in with a positive attitude, being somebody who wants to work very hard is really important. I know that sounds kind of cliche, but truly, I mean, I talk to a lot of students, and there certainly are some who come in with a little, like a sense of entitlement somewhat about, you know, they kind of expect a position in a think tank. So just being humble, being passionate, like showing that you've you know, studied this stuff for so long and you love it, and all of that is indeed really important. Just having a good attitude.
Kyle, how about you? What are your parting words of wisdom?
I think we've touched on a lot of areas so far. So the only thing I'll just say is for students to remember that success isn't linear. My career path has not been a linear one, nor has and many people I know in DC. So if you're struggling, just know it's not necessarily reflective of anything that, you know, your skills, your background. You just need to try and adjust and sort of realize that it's if you have to move out of the field that you're ideally in, that you want to think of ways in which you can leverage those news experiences to come back into the field that you were interested in. I think mine is a really telling experience. My switch out of the policy field in DC to banking and switch back really actually helped me get a leg up in my position where I am now. So I would encourage you, even if you have to leave your intended career path, veering off is okay. It's actually pretty much the norm, even though you don't necessarily hear it all the time. Just think of ways in which you can connect where you are to where you want to go.
That's really.
I would just say three words that I think tie into what Kyle and Katherine just said. I think commitment, determination, and flexibility.
Commitment, determination, and flexibility. Thank you for that. And it reminds me so much of some really great advice.
The 3 points.
Yeah, the 3 points. It reminds me, and the people on this call who are PhD candidates in history can relate to this. It's a slog. It's hard getting a job in any field right now. And I got some really great advice, which is really what all of you are saying, is that, you know, when you fail to get a job, when you fail to, you know, to get hired, it's rarely ever is it about you. You know, it's about what the employer feels like they want in that position. So it's really not you failing, right? It's the two things not coming together quite right. And I think, you know, if you keep the attitude positive, keep preparing the best you can, and something is going to work out, and something is going to work out, and it'll be tough, but don't let it get existential. don't let rejection after rejection. I think I applied for 70 jobs in my first few years out of graduate school, and, you know, got very, very few interviews, and it can be hard after a while, but I think determination is very key. Well, I want to thank our panelists so much for the time that they've spent with us today. I want to thank the attendees for coming. I have put a link in the chat to the webpage on the Center for East Asian Studies website, where it lists the other 3 events that we're going to be doing in this series on skills in digital humanities, working in journalism, and then jobs in policy and government. So if you are on this call now, I really encourage you to register and participate in those other events. And thank you very much.